In the misty wilds of medieval Scotland, the roads were dangerous places. Bandits haunted the paths, wolves stalked the forests, and storms could sweep in without warning. But the greatest danger was something no traveller expected. One night, a group of merchants failed to return home. Their horses were found days later, wandering riderless. Their carts were abandoned by the roadside, but of the men themselves, there was no trace. At first, people whispered of highwaymen, of thieves who struck under cover of darkness. But when more travelers vanished, not one or two, but dozens, a darker rumor began to spread. A rumor of a family who lived not in a house or a village, but in a hidden lair on the coast. A family who did not steal money or gold. They took only one thing: flesh. When the authorities finally uncovered the truth, they were not prepared for what they found. Deep inside a coastal cavern, concealed by the sea, investigators uncovered what looked like the aftermath of systematic killing. Heaps of bone, grim stores of preserved flesh, and signs of something far worse than banditry. And in the shadows of that lair stood not one killer, but an entire clan. Men, women, and children, all raised in blood. This was the legend of Alexander Sawney Bean, Scotland's most infamous cannibal. Whether this was a tale sharpened by fear or a crime history couldn't face, the name endured. Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark myths, strange histories, and forgotten legends are worth remembering, if you believe the shadows of the past still have lessons to teach us, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the torch burning and allows us to keep exploring the places history would rather forget. Tonight, we will enter that cave. We will trace the origins of Sawney Bean, from a disaffected man to the patriarch of a blood-soaked dynasty, from the silent roads of Ayrshire to the trial that shocked the crown of Scotland, and the whispered legends that inspired horror stories for centuries to come. This is not just the tale of a cannibal. It is the story of fear, of hunger, of how legends are born from blood. To understand it, we must first walk down the lonely road where the first victim disappeared. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Alexander Sawney Bean was not the kind of man remembered for skill or achievement. In the countryside of East Lothian, sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century, he grew up among farmers and tradesmen who knew the value of hard work. But Sawney was different. Where others ploughed fields, built fences, or cut timber, he saw only drudgery. From an early age, he showed a deep contempt for honest labor and those who engaged in it. Neighbors described him as idle and sullen. He was not destitute. His family had enough to survive. But he lacked ambition and refused to follow the path expected of him. At one point, he tried his hand at the rough work of hedging and ditching, cutting trenches through farmland and building barriers to mark property. It was a job of low prestige, but steady enough for a man of limited means. Yet even here, Sawney's resentment grew. He considered the work beneath him, and before long, he abandoned it altogether. The failure was not surprising to those around him. Sawney had no interest in toil, no pride in contributing to the community, and no respect for authority. In a time when survival depended on cooperation and labor, his attitude left him isolated. The young man drifted on the margins of society, too proud to work, too unskilled to rise, too stubborn to change. It was during this period of wandering that he met the woman who would alter the course of his life. History records little about her, not even her name. What survives are fragments of reputation. Some said she was a witch. Others claimed she had been cast out of her village for cruelty. Whatever the truth, she shared Sawney's disdain for society and his refusal to live within its rules. The two recognized themselves in each other, resentful, idle, and hostile to the world beyond their bond. Together, they left civilization behind. For most, exile was a punishment, the loss of home, kin, and the protection of law. But for Sawney and his partner, it was liberation. They sought a life with no masters, no obligations, and no one to scorn them. Their wandering brought them westward, across rough terrain and lonely roads, until they reached the wild Ayrshire coast. The landscape there was unforgiving. Jagged cliffs dropped into the sea. Storms rolled in without warning, and the land offered little for farming. Yet it was here, among the crags of Bennane Head, that they found what they were looking for: a cave. To most, it would have seemed inhospitable, but for Sawney and his wife, it was sanctuary. Here, they would be free. No magistrate could demand their labor. No priest could impose moral law. No villager could look down on them. This cave was not just shelter. It was a chance to live on their own terms. But freedom carried a cost. Farming was impossible. Hunting unreliable. Sawney had neither the skill nor the patience to provide for a household. Sooner or later, they would need to find another way. The question was not whether they could survive in this place. The question was how far they were willing to go to make survival possible. And for Sawney Bean, the answer would come in blood. For Sawney Bean and his wife, Bennane Cave was more than a hiding place. It was the beginning of a life severed completely from the world above. Most hours, the sea masked the opening entirely, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to stumble upon. Inside, the winding passages and deep chambers offered both security and space. The couple had found a fortress, but a fortress is nothing without resources. Life on the coast made survival difficult. There was little soil to till, and Sawney had no intention of returning to the back-breaking labor he had always despised. Fishing brought meager returns, and game was scarce. His wife, just as unwilling to endure hardship, had no desire to scrape by on bare subsistence. It was the road above them that offered the answer. The coastal path carried merchants, pilgrims, and laborers between villages. They did not come often, but they came regularly enough. To most, these travelers were simply neighbors or strangers passing through. To Sawney and his wife, they were something else entirely, sustenance waiting to be claimed. At first, their approach was hesitant. They lingered on the cliffs, watching, learning. When they finally struck, it was with crude efficiency. A rider pulled from his horse, a straggler dragged from the path. The victims were never found, the disappearances explained away by wolves, thieves, or misfortune. No one suspected that the danger lay beneath the cliffs. Inside the cavern, the couple turned each kill into a resource. Flesh was roasted or preserved for the lean months. Bones and scraps of clothing were discarded in the shadows. Even tools and trinkets were collected, forming a grim stockpile. What began as opportunistic strikes was becoming a system. Sawney and his wife were no longer merely hiding from the world. They had found a way to live without toil, law, or dependence on nature's whims. Their survival demanded only one thing: blood. The killings began quietly, almost unremarkably. The first victim was no wealthy noble or armored knight, but a laborer making his way home along the coastal path. He carried little of value, perhaps a few tools or scraps of food. What made him important was not what he possessed, but what he represented: an opportunity. Sawney and his wife struck without hesitation. There was no warning, no exchange of words. The man was dragged from the road, his throat cut before he could cry out. His death was quick, his disappearance unnoticed until much later. To the world outside, he was just another traveler lost to wolves, thieves, or misfortune. Inside the cave, however, his body became something far more significant. For the first time, the couple attempted to slaughter a man as though he were an animal. Their knives were dull, their cuts imprecise, and the floor of the cave was slick with blood. Yet they pressed on, dividing the body into portions. Some was roasted immediately, the smell of cooked flesh filling the chamber. The rest was salted and stored away. For the first time, the cavern's larder was full. The realization must have been intoxicating. They had discovered a method of survival that required no toil, no hunting, no dependence on nature's whims. The road provided all they needed, and their knives ensured it continued to do so. It was a transformation. The act was not merely survival, it was a revelation. Sawney and his wife had stumbled onto a system more sustainable than farming, more reliable than fishing, and far more appealing to their lazy, resentful natures. Why till soil under the watch of a landlord when the bones of travelers offered endless sustenance? Why labor when murder could sustain them better than honest work ever had? This first kill changed everything. The couple were no longer simply outcasts hiding from society. They had become predators with a method. The cave was no longer just a refuge. It had become something darker, a slaughterhouse. For most families, children are raised within the framework of society. They learn to speak, to work, to worship, and to live among others. But the children of Sawney Bean were born into a world with none of those lessons. Their nursery was a cavern. Their playground was a larder of human remains. Their teachers were two parents who had replaced farming and faith with ambush and murder. The first births came quickly. Sawney's wife gave life to child after child, each delivered in darkness, with the tide crashing outside and the smell of fire and blood within. These infants would never see the inside of a church, never hear the voice of a priest, never know the rhythms of village life. From their very first breath, they belonged to the shadows of Bennane Cave. Childhood for the Beans was unlike anything imaginable in the villages above. There were no toys, no lessons in scripture, no chores tied to crops or animals. Instead, they were raised on the family's only trade. From their earliest years, the children watched as bodies were dragged into the cavern. They saw the knives at work, the fires roasting flesh, the salted meat stored in jars. What would have horrified others became their normal. By the time they could walk, they had tasks of their own. Some carried wood for the fires. Others helped strip bodies or carried smaller parts deeper into the cave for storage. The oldest were given the responsibility of keeping watch, ensuring that no traveler escaped and no outsider stumbled too close. Each child was initiated not through ceremony, but through work, the work of blood. In this environment, morality never entered the picture. Murder was not framed as evil. Cannibalism was not forbidden. To the Bean children, these acts were as natural as harvesting grain or slaughtering livestock was to the villagers beyond the cliffs. They were not raised to question. They were raised to participate. As the years passed, the family grew rapidly. Every new child became another mouth to feed, but also another set of hands to help. The children were not simply consumers. They were collaborators. They assisted in carrying bodies back to the cavern, helping prepare the flesh, and learning the trade that defined their family. The work of Sawney and his wife had become a generational enterprise. The insularity of the cave ensured that the family turned inward. Brothers and sisters paired with each other. Cousins took cousins. Incest was not taboo when no other options existed. A second generation was born, even further removed from the outside world than the first. To them, villages were myths. Fields and farms were alien. The only world they knew was stone, fire, and flesh. The Bean children did not see themselves as trapped. They did not see themselves as cursed. To them, this was life. This was normal. And as they multiplied in the shadows of Bennane Head, what had begun as one couple's secret was becoming something far more dangerous: the foundation of a clan. By the time Sawney Bean's children had grown into adults and begun producing children of their own, Bennane Cave no longer housed a family. It contained a bloodline. The man who had once fled work and ridicule was now the patriarch of a sprawling, self-sustaining clan hidden beneath the cliffs of Ayrshire. The cave that had begun as a refuge was now alive with dozens of men, women, and children. They moved through its twisting passages like villagers through a town, each with roles and responsibilities. The older men led hunts on the road. Women and adolescents prepared and preserved the flesh. The younger children carried scraps or fetched driftwood for the fires. It was, in its own grotesque way, a community. What made it more dangerous was its discipline. Isolated from the outside world, the younger generations had no memory of any life but this. There were no ties to villages, no temptation to leave, no sympathy for outsiders. They were raised to kill and raised to obey. That insularity ensured secrecy. No one betrayed the family. No one escaped to reveal what was happening within the cave. With greater numbers came greater ambition. The ambushes were no longer limited to lone travelers. Entire groups were targeted. Merchants traveling together vanished. Families on pilgrimage disappeared without trace. Victims were overwhelmed by sheer numbers, dragged screaming into the shadows. The cavern filled with the remains of not just individuals, but entire parties, horses, carts, and belongings included. In the villages, fear turned to hysteria. People spoke of a curse upon the roads. Disappearances became so common that trade suffered, markets dwindled, and families refused to travel at night. Desperation bred suspicion, and innocence paid the price. All the while, the true killers watched from the cliffs, secure in their hidden domain. Inside the cavern, the Beans thrived. Their methods became refined, their numbers ever increasing. What had begun with a single, reluctant labourer's death had grown into a system of slaughter that spanned decades. By some accounts, the clan swelled to nearly 50 members. men, women, and children, united not by faith, not by law, but by the practice of ambush, murder, and cannibalism. The local authorities could not explain the scale of the disappearances. Rumors spread of witches, demons, or roaming wolves. Yet no one suspected that a human community, a secret society, had been growing in the dark, preying on travelers for nearly 30 years. Sawney Bean himself had achieved what he could never have imagined in East Lothian. He had built a dynasty, not of honor or land, but of blood. His legacy was not toil, but terror. The Sawney Bean clan was no longer a family hiding in shadows. They were a force, an underground nation feeding on the lifeblood of Scotland. And sooner or later, the outside world would be forced to reckon with them. For years, the disappearances were scattered enough to pass without connection. A rider missed from his route, a merchant who never arrived. Tragedies of the road explained away as the work of wolves, thieves, or misfortune. But as time went on, the pattern grew impossible to ignore. Entire families were swallowed. A husband never came home from market. A group of pilgrims set out and were never seen again. Even caravans traveling in daylight, with guards and wagons, sometimes failed to arrive at their destinations. At first, neighbors turned on one another. Whispers carried through villages like sparks on dry grass. An innkeeper was accused of killing his guests for profit. A ferryman was hanged after being blamed for drowning passengers. Shepherds and wanderers were beaten by mobs suspected of luring travelers astray. None of it stopped the vanishings. Markets dwindled, trade routes slowed. What had once been bustling roads became haunted paths. Few dared to travel alone, and those who did often left behind grieving families. Rumour gave way to hysteria. Some said Ayrshire was cursed, that the land itself was claiming souls. Others spoke of demons in the cliffs, or witches summoning evil spirits. Fear distorted reason until even the most mundane misfortune was attributed to the unseen terror. The local authorities struggled to respond. Sheriffs dispatched patrols, but they found no sign of bandits, no evidence of ambush. Bodies that were discovered were mangled beyond recognition, leading some to blame wild animals. But the numbers defied explanation. Wolves could not account for such systematic slaughter. As the years dragged on, the disappearances became a wound that spread beyond Ayrshire. Merchants in distant towns complained of ruined trade. Pilgrims whispered warnings to avoid the Scottish coast altogether. The fear was no longer local, it was national. And with each new report, the pressure on Edinburgh grew. In the royal court, the stories reached King James VI. He was no stranger to tales of witches and devils. His reign was marked by suspicion of the supernatural, his own writings warning of Satan's influence in Scotland. To him, the killings in Ayrshire were more than a crime wave. They were a threat to order itself, a spreading panic that could not be ignored. Whispers of terror had become cries for justice. Something was devouring Scotland's travellers, and no sheriff, no priest, no local lord could put an end to it. The people demanded action, and now the Crown would have to answer. For the first time, the king himself would intervene, and the hunt for the Sawney Bean clan was about to begin. When the Crown finally intervened, it did so with urgency. The stream of complaints from merchants, lords, and desperate villagers could no longer be dismissed. Trade was faltering, and Scotland's reputation with foreign travellers was being stained by fear. King James VI ordered his sheriffs and constables to take the matter in hand. Patrols were dispatched along the Ayrshire roads. Armed men rode in pairs, keeping a watch for signs of ambush. They questioned villagers, tracked supposed trails of wolves, and scoured the woods for bandits. Yet every effort ended in frustration. The roads appeared empty. The forests yielded no proof. What bodies they did discover were so mutilated that no cause could be confidently given. Wolves, perhaps. Highwaymen, maybe. But nothing ever tied together. The uncertainty bred violence of its own. In villages, suspicion turned inward. Families pointed fingers at neighbors who lived alone, at widows rumored to dabble in charms, at poor men who wandered without steady work. Innocent people were seized, beaten, even executed, but still the vanishings continued. Each failed accusation only deepened the mystery. The sheriffs tried baiting the supposed killers. Caravans were organized with heavy guard, meant to draw attackers into the open. But no ambush came. For weeks at a time, the roads would fall silent, as though the terror itself had vanished. Then, without warning, a new disappearance would strike elsewhere, leaving soldiers chasing shadows. By the late 1590s, the crisis had become intolerable. The scale of the losses could no longer be hidden from the crown. Pilgrims avoided the western roads entirely, forcing them into longer, more dangerous routes. Merchants demanded compensation for goods lost along the way. Local lords appealed directly to Edinburgh, insisting that lawlessness was spreading. James VI was not a man to tolerate disorder. Obsessed with rooting out threats to his kingdom, witches, Catholics, rebels, he saw in these vanishings a challenge to his authority. To him, the killings were not simply crimes. They were a plague of fear, eating into the very order of his realm. A royal proclamation was issued. No longer would the matter rest in the hands of local sheriffs or suspicious mobs. A greater force would be raised, armed and supplied by the crown itself. Their task was clear: sweep the coast, hunt down the killers, and put an end to the terror that had haunted Scotland for nearly 3 decades. This was not an ordinary commission. Some claimed the king himself would ride with the search party, determined to witness the truth with his own eyes. Whether that part is legend or fact, it gave the mission a weight no villager or sheriff could match. The investigation was no longer a scattered effort of rumours and guesses. It had become a royal mandate, and that mandate would soon descend on Ayrshire with soldiers, hounds, and fire. The hunters were coming, and at last, the Sawney Bean clan was about to be discovered. The royal commission that descended on Ayrshire was unlike anything the region had seen before. Soldiers rode in formation, banners snapping in the coastal wind. Behind them came hounds straining on their leashes, bred to track fugitives and criminals. The expedition moved with royal authority and purpose. This was no longer a search. It was a purge. The villagers, long paralyzed by fear, emerged from their homes to watch the column pass. For years they had whispered of demons and curses, of roads that swallowed travelers whole. Now they watched armed men march toward the coast, their torches and steel cutting through the dread like a blade. Some crossed themselves, others wept. At last, someone was taking the terror seriously. The hunt began with a sweep of the roads. Soldiers questioned innkeepers, ferrymen, shepherds, anyone who might know where travelers had last been seen. Caravans were traced to the very places they had vanished. Tracks were followed into the woods, only to fade into the earth. For days, the search turned up nothing. The coast seemed barren. The killers, if they existed at all, had vanished like smoke. Then came the dogs. At first, the hounds caught nothing. They sniffed the roadside, growled at passing carts, but gave no sign of pursuit. The soldiers pressed on, searching the cliffs that rose sharply from the shore. The villagers had long spoken of those cliffs as cursed, warning travelers to keep their distance. But the patrols found only stone, sea, and gulls. It was low tide when the dogs finally caught the scent. Near Bennane Head, they began to whine and strain against their leads. The soldiers followed them down a rocky incline, the waves pounding against the shore below. At the base of the cliff, half hidden by seaweed and shadow, was a narrow opening in the rock. Most would have dismissed it as nothing more than a crack in the stone, but the dogs barked furiously, their noses pressed to the darkness. Torches were lit. The entrance was barely wide enough to crawl through, the floor slick with seawater. The tide had kept it hidden for most of the day, but now it lay exposed. The soldiers squeezed inside, dragging their torches behind them. What they found was not a mere hollow, but a tunnel, a passage that twisted deep into the earth. The air grew colder, the walls were damp, the torches flickered, throwing long shadows on the stone. Step by step, the soldiers pressed forward, the barking of the dogs echoing off unseen chambers. And then the smell hit them. It was not the smell of the sea or of damp stone. It was heavier, metallic, unmistakable, the stench of blood and rot. The hounds had led them true. Whatever had haunted Scotland's roads for decades was waiting in the darkness ahead. The first torchlight revealed only damp stone. Narrow walls pressed in on every side, forcing the soldiers to stoop as they advanced. The air was foul, thick with the reek of rot and smoke. Every step forward echoed, the sounds swallowed quickly by the darkness ahead. Then the cavern widened. What the soldiers saw froze them in place. Bones, piles upon piles of them stacked like firewood against the walls. Skulls grinned from the shadows, their eye sockets empty, their jaws hanging open as though still screaming. Limbs dangled from crude hooks hammered into the stone, swaying slightly in the torchlight. In the center of the chamber lay heaps of clothing, boots and weapons, the stripped remnants of hundreds of victims. The smell was overwhelming, the stench of decay mingled with the acrid smoke of burning fat, a haze that clung to the stone ceiling. The ground beneath their boots was slick, not with seawater, but with blood soaked deep into the earth. The deeper they went, the more grotesque the sight became. In one chamber, salted flesh hung in strips, carefully stored as though in a butcher shop. In another, bones had been arranged into macabre piles, sorted by size and shape. Some were fresh, still glistening. Others were brittle, gnawed clean long ago. This was no random killing ground. It was organized butchery, refined over decades. And then, in the farthest chamber, they found the family. Nearly 50 of them, by some accounts, men, women, and children, all ragged and filthy, their eyes wide in the torchlight. Some snarled like cornered animals, others shrieked, and a few tried to flee deeper into the passages. But there was nowhere to run. Soldiers closed in from every side, blades drawn, hounds snapping at their heels. The sight was more disturbing than the bones. These were not monsters of legend. They were human, gaunt, wild, but unmistakably people. Children clung to their mothers, their faces smeared with blood. Men bared crude weapons made from rusted blades and stolen tools. Women screamed curses as soldiers dragged them away. Every one of them had been born and raised in this place, a society built on murder and cannibalism. Even hardened soldiers faltered. They had fought rebels, faced wild beasts, seen the dead on battlefields. But this was different. This was the corruption of humanity itself, a family raised in darkness with no law but blood. The Bean clan fought viciously, but the tide of steel and fire was too much. They were bound in chains, their cries echoing off the cavern walls. Torches illuminated their grotesque kingdom one last time as soldiers began carrying out the evidence: bones, belongings, the grotesque larders of flesh. The truth was undeniable. The terror that had haunted Scotland for nearly 30 years had been born, bred, and multiplied here, beneath Bennane Head. Now came the question that no soldier could answer in that moment. What punishment could possibly match crimes such as these? The capture of the Bean clan did not end the horror. It only shifted it from the darkness of Bennane Cave to the public eye. Soldiers who had dragged the family into daylight now faced an unsettling question. What was to be done with them? Accounts differ on what followed. Some say the clan was marched in chains to Edinburgh, their numbers shocking the capital as people lined the streets to glimpse the cannibals of Ayrshire. Others claim the king himself, too horrified to risk delay, ordered that no trial be held at all. To James VI, these were not subjects of law. They were an infection, and infections are cut out, not debated. What all stories agree upon is the nature of their end. The men were the first to suffer. Their hands and feet were hacked off, each blow leaving them writhing in agony. They were left to bleed slowly, their screams echoing across the crowd, until executioners delivered the final strike. The women and children met a different fate. They were bound together and cast into great fires, their shrieks smothered by the crackle of flames. No mercy was offered, no prayers spoken, no court would have called this justice. It was eradication. Sawney himself is said to have fought until the last. Some tales claim he cursed the king, spitting blood and threats until his tongue was torn from his mouth. Others say he laughed, declaring that Scotland had fed him well, and that his bloodline would be remembered longer than those who condemned him. Whatever the truth, his end was as brutal as his life. Piece by piece, he was destroyed, until nothing of the man remained. The executions were meant as spectacle, a warning as much as a punishment. Crowds were invited to watch, to see with their own eyes that the terror haunting their roads had not been demons or wolves, but people. Flesh and blood, just like them, twisted by cruelty and hunger into something unrecognizable. The message was clear. Such corruption would not be tolerated. When the last screams faded and the ashes cooled, Scotland breathed a sigh of relief. Trade returned to the roads, pilgrims resumed their journeys, and villages began to sleep without fear. The nightmare of Bennane Head was over. Or was it? Even then, questions lingered. Could nearly 50 killers truly have lived undetected for decades? Were the executions exactly as described, or had the tale grown with each retelling? Some historians argue that the entire saga was exaggerated, perhaps even invented, a piece of folklore twisted into history. But whether fact, myth, or something between, the name of Sawney Bean endured. His legacy was not land, nor wealth, nor honor. It was fear. And even today, the shadow of that fear still lingers, leaving us to wonder whether the Beans were Scotland's darkest family, or simply Scotland's darkest story. In the end, the cliffs of Bennane Head keep their silence. Sawney Bean's fate, as recorded in legend, was brutal. He and his entire clan hunted down, executed, and erased from the earth. The official tales speak of nearly 1,000 victims, butchered and devoured in the shadows of that cave. Yet, questions linger. Was there ever truly a family of cannibals beneath the Ayrshire coast? Or was the story a tool of propaganda, an invention to stoke fear, enforce obedience, and vilify the untamed Highlands? Some historians suggest the Beans never existed at all, their tales stitched together from folklore and political convenience. Others argue that the sheer persistence of the legend hints at a darker truth buried under centuries of embellishment. Over time, the story of Sawney Bean has grown beyond fact, becoming a piece of cultural memory, a nightmare passed from one generation to the next. His supposed cave still draws curious travelers, and his name remains shorthand for human monstrosity. The story of Sawney Bean forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Where does history end and myth begin? Was he Scotland's most prolific killer, or merely the invention of a fearful society? We want to hear your thoughts. Was Sawney Bean a real figure of horror, or a legend born of fear? Let us know your theory in the comments below. And if you find these explorations into the shadows of history as compelling as we do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Click the notification bell so you never miss an episode of the Midnight Archives. Thank you for watching.